Now let's move to this story. The BBC TV licence is set to increase by £1.50, taking it from £157.50 to you're ahead of me, £159. This is the first time from the 1st of April this year. The increase is considered to be smaller than last year when the licence went up by £3. The cost of the licence is set by the government, of course, and is expected to rise in line with inflation every April. This year's the increase comes just as 750,000 pensioners were reported to be abstaining from paying their licence fees in protest over the BBC doing away with the free service for over 75s. Let's speak with Lord Ed Vaizey, former Culture Minister, of course. Ed, afternoon to you. Always lovely to have you on the programme. I would imagine when you were in that gig over there at the Department for Culture, and anything with BBC on it came across the desk, did your eyes glaze over? Did you get the desire to gnaw your own elbows, knowing that yet again, here's a BBC dilemma for me?
I loved working with the BBC, but although people think I'm a sort of terrible old lefty, despite being a Tory, I did actually, in 2010, freeze the licence fee.
I remember.
For 5 years with the BBC's agreement, but we froze the licence fee because we felt age of austerity, people shouldn't be having to put up with licence fee increases. And we made a few other changes to the BBC, which meant the licence fee, I think, was better value for money. But I still remain a big supporter of the BBC. I think in the age we live in with the internet, so much disinformation and viral stories going round, it's good to have a national broadcaster, particularly in Brexit Britain, that reflects kind of British values. And I think this is a pretty modest increase. Although I never understand these odd numbers. Why 159 quid? It should be 160. But anyway, it's
you want to put it up even more. Have we got a headline from you there, Ed? Ed Vaizey says, put the licence fee up by another 50p.
There's your story, Ian. But I think we get good value for money for the BBC. I know all the complaints about it, and I know there are lots of things you can say that are bad about the BBC, but I think we'd miss it if it was gone.
But is there an argument? I mean, one might even go as far as saying a kind of irredeemable argument now that if nothing else, this thing has got to be looked at, and there has to be a reform either of the licence or an industrial scale look at what the BBC offers. You know, should it be doing things like Strictly? Should they have all of those additional local radio stations, etc.? All of this is, I mean, it's not unreasonable. You don't have to be a ferocious anti-BBC person these days to want to have that discussion, right?
Yeah, I think there's a massive debate coming down the line. I mean, everybody knows that the government is quite sceptical about some of the BBC services. The guy in government who's actually in charge of all this is a guy called John Whittingdale, who was the minister I worked with when I was in government. And he's a great guy. He's on the right of the Tory party. He's a supporter of the BBC, but he is sceptical about it. And you've also got this rumour that the former editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, will take over the media regulator Ofcom, and the media regulator does oversee the BBC. So there are all these issues coming together. And I think you're right, Ian. I think you should never, ever, nothing is ever a sacred cow. So while you can say, I love the BBC and we need something like the BBC to carry on, you shouldn't be afraid to challenge it. I, for example, have gone on record to say I've never got my head around why we still need Radio 1. Because people forget, you know, Radio 1 was set up in the 60s because there was a mass of pirate radio. There was clearly a demand. And the powers that be decided that the masses, as it were, should be given BBC Radio 1 to sate their demand for popular music. Well, that was in the 1960s. And now you've got a plethora of pop music stations. You've got, on the talk side, you've got 5 Live, but you've also got Talk Radio and others, Times Radio and other stations fulfilling that function. So the BBC should always look at its functions. Funny enough, I would turn it around what you said and say that its local radio function is probably the most important because local newspapers have been smashed to pieces by Google. So we do need local radio stations, but things like Radio 1 or indeed big popular shows like Strictly should be looked at. I was one who really supported the idea that Bake Off went to Channel 4. I think the BBC's got a great role in starting fantastic programmes, but it shouldn't hold on to them for dear life.
It becomes difficult though, doesn't it? The whole argument, you know, people cite Netflix and Amazon and Apple TV and all of these other kind of choice platforms that are offering, huge array of genres and programs and the like. And yes, you pay for it, but of course the argument is that that's your choice to pay for it. I used to resist those arguments a little bit, Ed. I used to think, well, come on, we're talking about the BBC here. It plays more than one role other than just make TV programs. But as we move on, it becomes really difficult to argue with somebody about the retaining certainly the license fee as it is, when you've got this backdrop of multi-channel TV, the likes of which we could never have imagined even 5 years ago. That argument becomes pretty tricky.
Yeah, it is difficult. I mean, the BBC's dilemma is this, that everyone pays the license fee, so it feels it has to provide something for everyone. But if you take the iPlayer, nobody voluntarily wants to pay for the iPlayer, but I don't see why you couldn't turn that into a subscription service. The analogy is with DVDs. If you paid your license fee 20 years ago, you didn't think twice about buying a Doctor Who DVD if you wanted to keep a box set of Doctor Who on your shelf. You didn't say, well, I've paid my license fee, so give me a free DVD. So if you're providing services on top of the core service, which is basically the main channels and the radio stations, I have no problem with the BBC potentially charging for those channels. There are some good things about the license fee that allow the BBC to be flexible. So we've all seen how the BBC has helped our kids during the pandemic in terms of homeschooling and education programs. And that's something that's a good thing where the BBC is flexible. But it should always be looking at the services it has, which potentially it could charge for or potentially even sell off to other media companies, while still keeping its core alive and keeping a core public service broadcaster alive in an age of very fragmented media.
And would you be in favour of that happening, just a final point, Ed, in order to make the BBC more relevant, or also to make it cheaper? Because the issue seems twofold here. There is the relevance of the BBC, that's a debate, but also the fact that there is this compulsory, or you might go to jail. I don't think we send many people to jail these days for not paying the TV licence, but you take the point. This idea that it's 160 quid pretty much. Many people thinking, well, if it was half of that, it would be a bit more palatable.
Well, I agree. Again, if I became Director General of the BBC, I always used to, perhaps half jokingly, but there was a serious point. I used to say, I long for the day when I get a Director General of the BBC who takes office and says, in 10 years' time, I will have reduced the licence fee by half. No one ever comes into the BBC with that mentality.
No.
And it would be interesting if they did.
Yeah. Ed, it'll be fascinating. Ed, thank you. Lord Ed Vaizey, former Culture Minister, with us here on Talk Radio. I mean, where does that one sit within your loose template of opinion around the BBC? I know Tom made a point. Well, I think we was talking about the Sun newspaper went up 18 quid in a year or something if you bought it every day, I guess. But of course, whilst I tend to agree a lot with what Tom says, that's your choice to buy a newspaper or not to buy it. And similar argument with Netflix and the like. I think that's about to go up. Apple TV is they're all about a tenner a month, aren't they? Disney Plus, I think, is 7 quid, $6.99 or something. They're all in that ballpark, but it's your choice. And that's when it becomes really difficult. And I could see the BBC focusing into a kind of, not necessarily news only. I've got more time for BBC Two in a way than I have for BBC One, because there is more relevance for the BBC in having those kind of slightly more esoteric programmes that you might get on BBC Two than you would on One. But then, of course, One is where the big audiences are, as distinct from some of the smaller channels. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer that you have to reform the BBC, and everybody has a little go at it and never really does it, not in any significant or meaningful way. And until somebody can come along and say, right, okay, first phase, the licence fee is now under £100. Symbolically, there's a psychological figure there. That would help the arguments along, and then you can look at the next phase.